Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Sustaining Sustainability for the year 2022. I am your host, CB Bhattacharya, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh, and I wish to start by wishing all our listeners a very happy and healthy new year. So for our first episode, I'm truly excited to be joined from Jersey City by Mita Mallick, Head of Inclusion, Equity, and Impact at Carta, which is a 9-year-old San Francisco-based cap table management and valuation software company valued at $7.4 billion. Previously, she was the head of diversity and inclusion and cross-cultural marketing at Unilever, and she has had an extensive career in the beauty and consumer products space. Mita also co-created the first of its kind Cultural Immersions series to increase the cultural competency of marketers, training over 5,000 marketers to date. Mita, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure, it's a great pleasure. Before we dive into the big questions, could you begin by telling us about the why behind your own professional journey to become the head of inclusion, equity, and impact at Carta? How would you define your personal purpose?
For me, my purpose is really about empowering those who have been excluded to help them find their voice. And once you start and found your voice, to never stop using it. And that really starts at the beginning for me. I'm the proud daughter of Indian immigrant parents. My parents were from India. I was born and raised here with my younger brother. And I was the funny looking, dark skinned girl with the long, funny looking braid whose parents spoke funny English until it wasn't funny anymore. And we were a handful of families of color outside of Boston. And I was bullied a lot, both verbally and physically, by my peers. And I never ever want anyone, whether it's in school or they're in their workplaces, to feel that they don't belong. And so that has been a huge part of who I am and a huge part of my purpose and why I'm here with you today.
Truly, truly, truly impressive. So, given your line of work, according to some recent studies by McKinsey as well as Great Place to Work Institute, one of the top reasons people are resigning actually has nothing to do with compensation, work life balance, or mental health, but rather their lack of sense of belonging in their organization. What are some steps managers can take to build a stronger sense of community amongst their employees?
That's a great question. And I think that's something that's really top of mind for anyone who's listening right now. Like I say, it's not the great resignation, it's the great awakening. Employees will no longer tolerate being in workplaces where they don't feel like they are seen, that they don't feel like they belong, where their value, where their contributions are valued. And so some of the things managers can do, anyone who's listening, is really thinking about, number one, how are you building community? It's hard to believe that this coming March, it will be for many of us 2 years that we've been working from home. And a shout out to frontline workers who never had that choice. But how are you helping people onboard virtually? How are you introducing them to the company? How are you getting them to understand the company's purpose and values? I think the second piece, which the study talks about that you mentioned for McKinsey, people of color are more likely to leave because they feel like they don't belong. So whether it's Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate and hate crimes, what are we doing to support communities of color? And then I think finally, how are we just being human and checking in with people? That's the most powerful tool we have, is one-on-ones. Are you doing that enough without a project list, but just to say, hey, Mita, how are you doing? I don't even want to talk to you about your project list. Like, what's going on in your world? Like, how are you feeling today? And I think that's so important.
Fascinating. So, since the death of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, just to continue our conversation on that theme,
Sure.
many companies have been making bold diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we call DEI, commitments. I mean, one thing, for example, that I have seen a lot on social media is companies appointing, chief diversity officers who are often people of color. So, What can companies do to ensure that they're making real progress on the issues that matter and avoid quote unquote empty commitments that look good but don't actually move the needle on these issues?
Yeah, that's another great question. I'm sure you've seen in the marketplace, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or many publications are talking about the billions of dollars that companies have pledged externally. And so one of the things that you see is there's a lot of pledge and commitments externally, but ask the employees how they feel about working there. So very quickly, we talk about diversity washing, as I call it, sort of a play off greenwashing. But companies who are very quick to celebrate Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month and Pride, and very quick to make external commitments. And sometimes their own employees don't even know that they're doing these things. They might find out in the press. So the thought is, your employees are your forgotten consumer. I strongly believe this. A lot of times we are chasing how we're going to sell who to and how much to. And start by working with your employees on some of the cultural changes that they need to see before you're running out to the marketplace to talk about it. And then I think the second thing I'm seeing a lot of is what I've coined diversity dressing. An example of that would be I'm on Instagram and I see an image of a beautiful Black woman, and it is from a beauty brand that I won't name, but it's an image, dark skinned woman, close up. And then I actually do the research, and they don't actually have beauty products that serve her skin tone.
So, are we saying very clearly to our listeners that the companies need to avoid that and kind of, just focus more on the actual progress that they're making, right?
Absolutely, and track it. I think progress is slow, and that is difficult because people don't like to hear that, because how much longer do we have to wait for progress? But at the same time, you can't pretend to accelerate it. That's what you're doing with that Instagram post.
Mm. So, would it be fair to say that we need a stronger moral foundation in society, and maybe this is a nod to education or the need for education at school levels, kind of in middle school, primary school, high school, whatever. Because why are people when they're older doing these kinds of things, knowing fully well that they're going to be found out sooner or later?
I think that's a great point. I always say inclusion starts at our kitchen tables, right? I mean, I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I think about that every day. What am I doing to raise kind and inclusive human beings? And this is where, when we start to use language like funny, crazy, odd, strange, stupid, lazy, our kids are watching us, and that becomes the gateway for stereotyping people, just like happened to me when I was growing up, because I was being othered and I was different. And that is eventually the gateway to hate. And so that starts really young. Those things start to be seated in our brains. And to your point, thinking about how you are respecting and understanding cultures and communities that aren't your own lived experience, and how you can gain empathy for experiences that aren't your own.
So, just shifting gears a little bit, as you know, environmental social governance, or popularly known as ESG
Mhm.
metrics, are becoming mainstream topics for financiers, regulators, and boards, with an ever growing number of frameworks and initiatives to measure a company's ESG impacts and progress. What do you think are some of the most important metrics in the S category, the social category,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
will actually indicate how well a company is setting its workforce up for success, particularly from a DEI perspective?
Well, I will offer another framework. Is the framework I operate within this space when I think about how I help organizations, and it's how do you build end-to-end inclusion ecosystems. And the first pillar, the first one I think about, is workforce. So how are you building a workforce that is representative of the communities you serve, whether that's based out of US, globally, locally. And that's not just for workforce, it's also, as you just mentioned, board governance as well, C suite and the board. The second is how your brands show up in the marketplace and your services. And from a US perspective, we know that the recent Nielsen data shows us, a Nielsen study, that over There's over $3.3 trillion of spending power with the multicultural consumer. So the question is, how are you authentically and with purpose serving this consumer? The third is supplier diversity. So we talk about checks and who we write checks to. And oftentimes we have the same sort of 5 suppliers we go to. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, who else can we bring into our ecosystem? And the last pillar I like to think about is, it's really easy to put Black Lives Matter on an Instagram post. You can say that you stand for values, but when are you ready to stand up for them? Companies are feeling pressure to stand up and do something about it. And you could argue it's from, is it all different key stakeholders? The pressure is also really strong from employees, stronger than it's ever been before.
And indeed, that is very much a key stakeholder group on which we have to keep an eye. And that leads to an interesting question. You mentioned purpose as being something important. So let me push you on that a little bit more. I mean, so how
Sure.
important do you think is it for a company to be purpose driven in this day and age to actually get ahead of all these kinds of issues that we are talking about?
I think it's one of the biggest superpowers a company can have. It is what's going to attract you to the company. It is what attracted me to Carta. And listen, purpose can be a lofty word, but what is it that gets you out of bed other than your paycheck? And what is it about your job that fulfills you? And what is it about the company's mission that fulfills you? And as you know and talk about a lot, is that purpose is not, for a company, if you're going to do purpose well, you're not going to stand up for maybe every single social justice issue out there, nor should you, because you probably won't get it right. But the question is, what are the things that you should stand up for that actually align with your values?
Yeah, and indeed, I have observed a lot of my work that purpose-driven companies invariably do better in the longer run, compared to other companies that are still chasing
Yeah.
shareholder value maximization.
Yeah. And it goes back to the question you asked me earlier about belonging. If you have a really clear purpose and how you're standing up in this world and showing up in the world, employees feel like they own a piece of that. And when they feel like they own a piece of that and they're part of this greater mission, I'm not leaving for $20,000, $30,000 more. I'm not leaving for fancy snacks or free pizza
Mhm.
or tech gadgets. I'm just not.
Terrific. Now, Mita, we are coming almost to the close of our time. So fascinating conversation, but I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask you.
Sure.
I see that you're a top LinkedIn voice, and I see your amazing posts on LinkedIn all the time. I also know that, as you said, you have 2 small children, you have a
Right.
full-time job and family. So how are you doing it all? I mean, please give us some advice.
So we were joking about this earlier. I wonder how often my husband gets asked that question, and I will ask him that at dinner tonight because I don't think we ask men that question a lot. And I recently posted about this on LinkedIn because people ask me that a lot. And my answer is, I have stopped Netflix binging, I stopped drinking, and I stopped scrolling for more Zoom tops that I don't need. And it's funny, not funny, only to say that you focus on the things that matter. And I think nothing's proven out more than in the last 19 months. And a lot of grief and suffering and pain individuals have been through, is life is short. And so I think to myself, like, what am I waiting for? And where do I want to make impact? And so just focusing in on that.
If we could all be so disciplined, Mita, just
I don't know
one.
about that. I don't know. It goes back and forth, but it's just that thought of, what are you waiting for?
Surely, surely, yeah. And then that leads me to my final question as we are getting to the close of our time. What call to action would you make to our listeners today?
It is not your chief diversity officer's job or whoever is running DE&I to change the culture. It's all of our jobs. We should all be acting like we are heads of DE&I. And so what does that look like? Every single day, there are things you can be doing to make a difference in your organizations. Number one, if you are hiring or you're on a team that's hiring, ask the recruiting team about diverse slates. Do you have diverse slates? How are you ensuring we have diverse slates? Where are we sourcing talent from? Second, if you're sitting in a talent review, which many of us do in organizations, and someone says, well, that's a really big promotion for Mita and she has 2 little kids and I'm not sure she's going to be able to do it. You should ask the question, if Mita was a man, would we be having this conversation? And then the last example I'll give is, vote with your wallet, both within your company and outside of your company. If you're making a video, it's $5,000. I don't care how small of an amount it is. Ask the question and say, well, why can't we go hire another supplier? Why can't we work with this veteran-owned business? Why are we going to the same large agency that we work with every time? And in your personal life, use your wallet, as you're thinking of thank you gifts and different things, like support Black and Brown founders. And I'll give a shout out to Partake Foods and Tea Drops and Omsom. So you can check out those 3 brands. All happen to be in the food and beverage category.
Mita Mallick, it's been a pleasure spending some of your very, very busy time with you today. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
And before I sign off, I do want to say that this podcast is made possible with the help of my colleagues Chris Gassman, who is Associate Director at the Center for Sustainable Business, and Danny Nye, who's Center Associate at the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition of Sustaining Sustainability.